He's big, he's brash, he doesn't hold back. He told somebody at Prime Minister's Questions to shut up on Wednesday. Today's Daily Tea hears from none other than Reform MP Lee Anderson.
And as another senior Conservative defects to reform, we'll be finding out from him why most Tory MPs wouldn't be welcome in his party and what reform would do about the small boats crisis.
Instead of picking them up and bringing them to the UK, they should be picking them up and taking them straight back to France. And if that means upsetting the French, then so what? We've given them over £500 million so far. And what have they done with that money, Dom? They bought one Stanley knife and they slashed a boat last week and stopped about 30 migrants coming over. A complete waste of money.
Let's discuss all things reform now. It's the reform hour, Gordon, which we always have, don't we? We're having a moment for reform.
It does feel like it.
Again. Yeah. And Dom Penna, our political correspondent, is in the studio because you interviewed Lee Anderson. Hi, Dom.
Hello.
And we will speak about Lee Anderson in just a moment, but can we please talk about Sir Jake Berry? Because he has defected from the Conservatives to Reform, which is significant because he was a Tory party chairman, besties with Boris Johnson.
Yeah. What do you make of it, Dom?
It's pretty astonishing, not just because of the timing. So Sir Jake is the second former Tory cabinet minister in the space of 2 or 3 days after David Jones, the former Brexit minister and Welsh secretary, also jumped ship to Reform earlier on this week. And then almost completely out of nowhere, it must have been at about 9:20 last night that we got the news as well that in an article for another newspaper, Sir Jake had declared, I was Tory party chairman, albeit only for 6 or 7 weeks under Liz Truss. But he now sees that the Tories, to his mind, are as bad as Labour. He said that they were responsible for big failures on tax, big failures on immigration, and in his words, reform is the only remaining hope.
Yeah. I mean, is this very damaging for the Tories, or are Tories just saying, I'm guessing that there'll be Tory MPs who are just saying these are people who are desperate for attention, they're not MPs anymore, they're missing being important. What are people saying? It's not even
that, is it? It's probably that they haven't got any electoral hope under the Tories, so it's the last chance to lose, because he'll be hoping to stand for reform, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is far
as an
more...
MP.
Yeah, well, I would imagine that's far more troublesome for the Tories, because if lots of people think my only chance of getting re-elected is to jump ship, then that is a problem for them, because then more might follow. I don't know. What are you hearing, Tom?
So, as you said, Gordon, there are a lot of Tories who are dismissing this latest defection, saying, well, this is just Sir Jake wanting to cling to relevance, hopping on what they see as a reform bandwagon. But that is a reform bandwagon that has long overtaken the Tories in the polls. If we believe Reform's membership numbers, they have significantly more members now, a far bigger grassroots, a more enthusiastic grassroots than the Tories. And it was interesting, the reaction of fellow sort of former Red Wall MPs who, like Sir Jake, represented those northern constituencies where, especially under his old mate Boris Johnson, the Tories did very well. But the Tories lost almost all of those seats at the election last year, and they were saying it's sad that Sir Jake has defected, but it is understandable because in seats like that, the Tory brand is just so damaged, at least for the time being. They lost almost all of those Red Wall, Heartland seats, and in those seats, it is Reform. I read a stat last week, and I think one of 3 people who voted the Tories and Boris in 2019 at the height of the Brexit wars would now want to back Nigel Farage. It is a lot of the same voters. So in isolation, is this a particularly damaging defection? Not really. As part of a wider drip of defections and the wider trend and what it says about Reform hopes versus Tory hopes, it could well prove very damaging indeed.
I think they need a biggie. They need somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg or Priti Patel.
Yeah.
Or someone like that. And because they are very conservatives, they're least likely to happen, but most likely to have the most impact precisely because they are lifelong Conservative members and supporters.
Yeah, I suspect that there will be people who will now say that because Jake Berry was so close to Boris, that people will now say, oh, is Boris going to join Reform? I can't.
Yes.
That's not going to happen.
No,
I don't think.
I don't think it's going to return to the fray. I heard something interesting last week. The theory goes that in North East Somerset, which may be up for a by-election because Dan Norris is currently being investigated by Labour, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg's old seat. he's considering whether to contest it for the Conservatives, but maybe Aaron Banks is considering contesting it for Reform, and therefore, if Jacob steps back, he hasn't quite joined Reform, but he's facilitated Reform, which could be interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Anyway, on to Lee Anderson, that other great Reform MP. Also, wasn't this a bit of a diversion technique because of the James McMurdoch investigation? Like, oh, look, we've got a shiny new Tory to put in our ranks.
Yes, it does feel a bit like it, doesn't it?
So, Lee Anderson, Dom.
He was
what
well ahead
happened?
of the curve.
Was
He was
he?
well ahead of the curve in that he joined Reform from the Tories the best part of a year and a half ago.
Yes.
February 2024 was that almighty row over his comments about Sir Sadiq Khan and the Labour
Yes.
Mayor of London. Lee then became the first Reform MP, their first man in the Commons, was re-elected under a Reform ticket at the election last year, and I had a chat with him for the Telegraph Politics newsletter, which was half an hour, quite unlike, I think, any other political interview that I've done, because when you speak, for example, to a cabinet or shadow cabinet minister, there is just that real sense of them being quite scripted, quite media managed, and sort of knowing on certain things where to draw the line. None of those three really applied with Lee, who is very straight talking, he will give you a direct answer to a direct question. And I think any doubt about his authenticity that people might have had in terms of is he signed up to the Reform project, I think that's long gone. He clearly lives and breathes it.
He has a reputation for hating the media and hating interviews, doesn't he? So do you get the feeling he's got over that?
I would think so. And I mean, there was a bit of, oh, hi, Dom, nice to be here. He wasn't completely enamoured with the thought of spending half an hour with a journalist. But I think what he genuinely did enjoy, considering that Telegraph readers and Daily Tea listeners and newsletter subscribers had submitted these questions, he enjoyed the back and forth of engaging with, oh, Philip has this question, Caroline has this question, etc., etc. So he did enjoy that sense of engagement, I think, more than he would maybe a more conventional interview.
All right, well, let's get into the clips because we want to hear what he had to say to some of your very straight questions, Dom. So you started off by asking him a good question. This is something that is playing in the minds of Telegraph readers and listeners and watchers, for those on YouTube. Is Reform serious?
Last election, Dom, we had 4.1 million people vote for us in this country. Just in May, just a few weeks ago, we had hundreds of thousands of people again vote for Reform UK. We won 10 councils. We got nearly 700 councillors, 2 mayoralships as well. We won a by-election this year. So, we're only going one way. The trajectory is up. We're a growing party. We're a start-up party. We're learning. There's bumps in the road. There's going to be casualties, on the path to victory in 2029. And what we're doing at the moment is we have a weekly meeting with our chairman, with Nigel, with the other MPs. We've got, we're developing policy behind closed doors, and that will be released, as the election gets nearer and nearer. But people say you can't be a serious party. The other parties have got, tons of experience of being in government, and we see it at local level as well, where the main two parties have got tons of experience of running local councils, but experience in what, Dom? Making a complete hash of things. The country is in a right state at the moment, and that's due to 14 years of a Tory government. I was part of that for 5 years, and now the Labour Party, the Labour government, are actually making it worse. It's time to get some fresh people in. I'd walked to Westminster Hall today, and I got mobbed by about 15 young lads from Birmingham, 17, 18-year-olds, sixth formers. Every single one was a potential Reform voter, definitely Reform supporters, and 2 of them were actually members. So the young people in this country are rebelling. They've had enough. They've seen what's happened to this country, and they're thinking, we've had enough. They love Nigel. They love Nigel Farage. He's got a huge following on TikTok and on his social media. They want something different. I've always thought that politics is pretty simple. You just go home at the weekend, listen to your constituents, listen to your friends, listen to mum and dad, listen to your family, to your neighbours, and then the following week you come back down to this madhouse and you say what they're saying. It's dead easy.
Really interesting, I think, Dom, that he said we're developing policy behind closed doors, and that will be released as the election gets nearer and nearer. That's something which obviously Kemi Badenoch is doing. It's her big thing. She says we don't want to just come out and say, here's all our policies. We actually need to ask people what they want our policies to be. And there is a lot of criticism of her by Tory MPs. They think that she's not being visible enough because she's sort of going away and thinking too much. Reform is doing both, isn't it? So Lee Anderson is saying, we're doing this policy development, but at the same time, you've got Farage and Lee Anderson and people going out there selling policies, knowing what they stand for. Couldn't Kemi Badenoch also do both?
And that has been one of the massive criticisms of Kemi Badenoch during her first 8 months in charge. There is this sense that she just isn't visible. And in many cases, she's not even giving an idea of, oh, if I were in power, I would do X, Y, Z. Whereas Nigel Farage has been very good at that without tying himself down, as Lee said in the interview, to the sort of policy commitments that might not look so smart or might be so timely in 3 or 4 years' time. So I think what Reform are managing is almost the best of both worlds, whereas Badenoch, it feels like there are neither at times.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, as well, because Johnson had said, I think last week, stop mentioning Farage, the Tories are making a mistake. And then Badenoch keeps on doing this thing about describing Farage as somebody with a fag and a pint. And then Lee Anderson has that kind of publican kind of vibe about him. He even does his GB News show from the pub. But actually, that's what appeals to the public about them. So she's almost like playing up to their strengths there. Having said that, there are concerns, aren't there, Dom, about how they might perform in government. And you asked Lee Anderson that.
There's going to be some talent come through in the next election. We're going to have some decent people that stand for election that get in, successful business owners and people that's worked in a whole range of industries. Why would you have somebody being a health secretary that hasn't got the first idea how the health service works? It's the same with all the cabinet positions. I mean, and then they flip them after a year, 18 months, and put somebody else in. Thinking, look at the Labour cabinet at the moment. Not one's run a business.
What would your dream cabinet job be?
Oh, that's a good job. That's a good question. DWP, Works and Pensions.
Well, obviously, anything that involves reform never strays far away from migration and small boats. And you asked him about what the details of their policy would be, how they would stop the boats.
We've got to leave the ECHR, which is a reform policy. We've got to have our own Bill of Rights. And we've got to get tough with the French, and we've seen it just this week, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, over 2,000 came in 1 week. I've always said pushbacks. I've been to France. I've been in the migrant camps. I've spoke to the migrants, and they're not genuine asylum seekers, I think the penny is finally dropping with some of the wets in the chamber. They're economic migrants. They're coming for a better life. They're coming for a life of crime, a lot of them. And we know that some of them are going to commit crimes, sex crimes, murders, acts of terror. What the hell are we playing at? I would like to see our Navy in the Channel patrolling our shores, protecting our borders, and the Border Force, instead of picking them up and bringing them to the UK, they should be picking them up and taking them straight back to France. And if that means upsetting the French, then so what? We've given them over £500 million so far, and what have they done with that money, Dom? They bought one Stanley knife and they slashed a boat last week and stopped about 30 migrants coming over. A complete waste of money.
There is clarity there, Dom, isn't there? Net zero migration, leave the ECHR. Right, lovely jubbly. At least we know where you stand. It might not be practical, but at least it's clear. What's interesting about Lee Anderson in this little political journey he's been on, it's not been in a straight line, let's be honest. It's been a little zigzag, Dom. He was a Labourite, then he became a Tory briefly, now he's in Reform. He represents that sort of J.D. Vancian type figure of, on one hand, being robustly right-wing on immigration, the economy, and I would say the culture wars. And yet, of course, he does lean left economically. And you asked him about the relationship between Reform, the Tories and Thatcher, and his response was actually quite interesting.
And do you regret having been sort of sticking by the Tory party so long?
It's a difficult one, because when I first came to Parliament, I thought, I'd done the right. I know I'd done the right thing by my constituency, but I expected a different parliamentary party. I expected them to be, the Tories of old, of Thatcher's days, and they weren't. I spoke to some of them in the tea room and in the chamber. And I thought, oh, my goodness, why are you even in this party? You should be sat across there with the Labour lot, or the Lib Dems, or the Greens. It's a bittersweet for me, for Thatcher. We hated her
of course, with Ashfield.
My dad was a miner, and my granddad, great-granddad. I followed my dad into the pits. I had 12 years underground. And we lived in a community that was absolutely devastated by the pit closures. And, I mean, literally, overnight, a whole community was just wiped out. No job, because in my village, it was a coal mine. 1,000 men worked at the coal mine. It closed. That's 1,000 wages gone straight away. And with the coal mine goes the social club, goes the cricket team, the rugby team, the football team, the brass band, the welfare grounds. Everything goes. It kills a community. And this is what Thatcher didn't get, and the Tory government at the time. For Nigel and Richard, living in the south of the country, the 80s was loads of money, weren't it? They were making, shitloads of money. Many years later, I forgave her after I met a chap in our local marketplace when I was campaigning there for the Labour Party in 2015. And this is the moment I forgave Thatcher. And I asked him which way he was voting. And he was 80-odd, he was an ex-coal miner. He says, I'm voting Conservative. I said, well, why? You're an ex-miner, you're trade unionists. Maggie shut all the pits. Right to buy. If you work hard, you can have your house. In Ashfield, probably 5% of people owned their own property at that time. It was beyond most people's wildest dreams to actually have a mortgage and own your property. So he bought his house, and he says to me, young man, I sit on my settee, look through my window, I look at my greenhouse. He said, I look at my fish pond and my new fence and my lawn and my patio. He says, and I look around my house. He said, and that's all mine and my missus's. That's thanks to Maggie Thatcher. He says, when I die, I will die happy, because that's going to my children and grandchildren, and I'm no longer worthless. And that's the most powerful story I've ever heard, and then the penny dropped then.
Yeah, really interesting. Do you think Keir Starmer understands that?
I think there have certainly been signs at times that he does. I think that if you compare Labour's absolute hard left and far left economics in the Jeremy Corbyn years, Sir Keir Starmer has been far keener to paint Labour as a party of home ownership with the 1.5 million new homes pledge, as the party of business. In practice, in Labour's first year in government, we've seen a lot less of that, £40 billion in tax rises. Lots of signs that 1.5 million homes target already just isn't going to happen. But I think what Lee Anderson did seem to instinctively understand in communities like his, in that so-called red wall, which is so much talked about, but at times it feels like it's so little understood, that sense of wanting to get on in life, that sense of aspiration, and they are what we would probably call small c conservative values, but really they are just general hopes and dreams that people have for them and their families. And with Anderson on the front bench and a lot of what Farage is saying about reindustrialising those towns and cities, it feels like ahead of what will be a very, very long lead up to that next election, Reform does seem to have a head start in understanding it. The question is, would they be able to act on it? Labour has promised a lot, so far delivered a little. Reform could easily fall into the same trap.
Dom Penna, give your newsletter a plug, please, as you did this for the newsletter.
Yes, so I am lucky enough to be writing the Telegraph Politics newsletter every day, which goes out to both our wonderful Telegraph subscribers and also non-subscribers can register. So as well as getting a few Telegraph articles every week, they can get the newsletter in the inbox. It lands at about 1 p.m. every day. Lots of fun Q&As with people from all across the political spectrum. It was Lisa and Andy last time. It was Lee this time. And my analysis and a digest of this is what's happening in politics at the moment. This is what it means for you. This is where it might all be going.
Love it. Dom Penna, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you.